Don't spend it all in one place at your age.
Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the counter. The branch manager's voice carried across the lobby, flat and final, as she slid a stack of $100 bills back through the slot rather than counting them into the woman's hands. "This is a lot of cash for someone your age to be moving around alone," she said. "I'd feel a lot better if we called someone to come sit with you before we go any further." The older woman standing at the counter did not raise her voice. She simply set both hands flat on the marble ledge and said, "That is my money, in my account, that I have banked at this branch for 11 years. Behind her, a line of customers had gone quiet, and near the revolving doors, a man in a gray suit had just walked in to surprise his mother for lunch, in time to hear a bank manager accuse her of not understanding her own finances. Let me tell you who that woman was, because you will not understand the weight of her patience until you understand what it took to build it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Odette Marsh was born in a small town outside Macon, Georgia, the only daughter of a woman who cleaned houses 6 days a week and never once complained about it in front of her child. Odette was sharp with numbers and sharper with words, the kind of girl who corrected her teachers, grammar under her breath, and got sent to the hallway for it more than once. She left Georgia at 19 with $80 in her purse and a stenography certificate she had paid for herself, one night class at a time, working a diner counter until 2 in the morning to cover the tuition. She became the first black court reporter ever hired at the county courthouse 3 states north, a job she held for 32 years, sitting silently at the edge of thousands of trials, transcribing verdicts, divorces, custody battles, and criminal sentences word for word without ever once being asked her opinion of any of them. She used to tell Marcus, when he was young enough to ask why she never talked about her work at dinner, that her entire job was to make sure nobody's words ever quietly disappeared, that a courtroom without an honest transcript was a courtroom where powerful people could simply say whatever benefited them, and trust that no one would remember it accurately later. She kept a private habit for most of her career, jotting a single line in a personal notebook at the end of any day that unsettled her, not about the verdicts themselves, but about the small unrecorded moments. A judge's offhand comment, a lawyer's dismissive tone toward a witness, the kind of thing that never made it into an official transcript because nobody thought to ask her to include it. She had 31 of those notebooks by the time she retired, and she never once imagined that the discipline of noticing quiet things and writing them down accurately would be the exact skill her own son would need 3 decades later, standing at a bank counter, watching someone try to write his mother's story a different way than the one that had actually happened. She married a firefighter named Samuel Marsh the same year she got that courthouse job, a broad, quiet man who used to say that between the two of them, he ran into burning buildings, and she sat calmly inside burning rooms all day, and neither of them thought the other's job was the easy one. They had one son, Marcus, and Samuel used to tell him that the bravest people in any room are rarely the loudest ones in it. Samuel died when Marcus was 12, pulled a teenager out of a collapsing stairwell, and never made it out behind her. Odette raised her son alone after that, on a court reporter's salary, in a 2-bedroom house she refused to sell no matter how many real estate agents knocked on the door over the years telling her the land underneath it had gotten valuable. Marcus grew up watching his mother work 12-hour trial days and then come home to grade his math homework at the kitchen table before falling asleep in her chair with a legal pad still in her lap. He went to college on a partial scholarship and a stack of loans, studied accounting, and eventually found his way into the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, where he now spent his days investigating exactly the kind of scheme his mother was about to be accused of being a victim of. He specialized in elder fraud, wire scams, and predatory lending, and he had sat across from hundreds of frightened, embarrassed victims over the years, telling every single one of them that being deceived was never something to be ashamed of. He remembered the night his father died with a clarity that had never dulled with time. He was 12, doing homework at that same kitchen table, when two men in dress uniforms knocked on the door instead of Samuel walking through it himself the way he always did after a shift. Odette had answered the door already knowing, somehow, before either man said a word, the way people who have spent their lives around courtrooms and hard news sometimes simply know a moment before it arrives. She had thanked the men for coming in person rather than calling, made them a pot of coffee neither of them drank, and only after they left did she sit down across from her son and tell him, in the same steady voice she used for everything, that his father was not coming home, and that the bravest thing either of them could do now was keep getting up in the morning anyway. Marcus had asked her, that night and many nights afterward, how she managed to stay so calm about everything, and she always gave him some version of the same answer. Calm isn't the absence of feeling something, she told him once. It's deciding not to hand it to the first person who doesn't deserve it. That lesson followed Marcus into every interview room he ever sat in as an agent. And it was the same lesson that kept him rooted in place at that bank counter years later, rather than raising his voice, the moment he understood what he was watching. That Thursday, Marcus had a rare afternoon off and had planned, for weeks, to surprise his mother for lunch near the courthouse, where she had worked most of her life before retiring 3 years earlier. He walked into First Meridian Bank a few minutes before noon, planning to wait by the door until she finished her errand, and instead heard a branch manager telling his mother, in front of a full lobby, that she did not seem to understand her own money. To understand what led to that Thursday, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier, to the day Odette's oldest friend, a widow named Humiliates, called her in tears because a hospital billing office was threatening to place a lien on the small house Corrine had lived in for 40 years over a medical bill that had ballooned past $30,000 after a stroke left her unable to work. Corrine had explained, through tears, that she had tried for months to set up a payment plan with the hospital's billing department, only to be transferred between 4 different representatives, each one telling her a different minimum monthly amount, none of which she could actually afford on her fixed income, until a certified letter finally arrived stating that the hospital's collections attorney would file for a lien within 30 days absent a lump sum payment. Odette had spent her whole life the same careful way, saving a little every month out of a court reporter's modest salary, and she had $31,000 sitting in a savings account. She had built slowly over 3 decades for exactly this kind of emergency, though she had always imagined it would be her own. She decided within a day that she was going to withdraw it and hand it to Corrine before the lien deadline, in cash, because Corrine did not trust wire transfers after already being targeted twice by scammers pretending to be her bank. The branch manager, a woman named Diane Kessler who had worked at that location for 22 years, pulled Odette's withdrawal request up on her screen and did not like what she saw. The bank's internal fraud prevention system flagged large cash withdrawals from customers over 60 for what it called an enhanced verification review, a policy that existed, on paper, to protect elderly customers from exactly the kind of scam Corrine herself had already survived twice. In practice, at that branch, under Diane Kessler's 22 years of discretion over how strictly to apply it, the flag rarely slowed down a white customer moving similar sums for a home renovation or a family gift. It stopped Odette cold. Diane asked her, in front of the next 3 customers in line, whether someone had called her recently asking for money, whether she had given anyone her account information over the phone, whether there was a man in her life pressuring her to move funds quickly. Odette answered every question patiently the first time. She explained Corrine, the hospital lien, the 40 years in that house. Diane nodded along without appearing to actually hear any of it, then told her she would need to place a temporary hold on the withdrawal and have Odette speak with a fraud specialist before releasing anything. Odette asked to speak with that specialist immediately. Diane told her the specialist worked out of a call center and typically returned messages within 3 to 5 business days. "I don't have 3 to 5 business days," Odette said. "My friend has a lien deadline in 1 week." Diane's expression did not change. "I understand this is frustrating," she said, in the exact even tone people use when they have decided in advance that nothing you say is going to move them. "But I have a responsibility to protect our customers, especially our older customers, from making decisions they might regret." Odette told her evenly that she was 66 years old, not confused, and perfectly capable of deciding what to do with money she had saved herself over 3 decades. Diane slid the stack of bills back through the slot rather than counting it into her hands and said the line that Marcus walked in just in time to hear. "Ma'am, that's a lot of cash for someone your age to be moving around alone. I'd feel a lot better if we called someone to come sit with you before we go any further." To understand why Odette held her temper as long as she did that morning, it helps to know this was not the first small friction she had felt at that branch, only the first time it had ever escalated this far. 3 years earlier, shortly after she retired, she had gone in to close out a certificate of deposit and roll the funds into a new account, a simple transaction she had done at other banks without incident, and a teller had asked her, apparently in good faith, whether she had a family member who usually handled her banking for her. Odette had laughed it off at the time, assuming the young teller simply did not know what to make of an older customer moving money on her own. A year after that, she had noticed Diane Kessler personally step in to review a modest $4,000 transfer to Marcus for a shared family expense, a level of attention she never saw applied to the elderly white man 2 windows down moving a similar sum the same afternoon. She mentioned neither incident to anyone, filed no complaint, assumed each time that she was simply imagining a pattern in things that were probably unrelated, the way people who have spent a lifetime being doubted often talk themselves out of trusting their own read on a room. Behind Diane, at the next station over, a young teller named Maya Osai had been quietly processing a deposit throughout the entire exchange, her hands slowing with every passing minute until she had stopped moving altogether, staring down at her own counter rather than at Odette. Maya had been hired at that branch 18 months earlier, straight out of a community college business program, and she had noticed the same pattern in Diane's flagging decisions almost from her first month on the job. Noticed it the way you notice something you are not yet senior enough to say out loud without risking your own position. She had mentioned it once carefully to another teller during a break, and been told plainly that Diane controlled every schedule and every performance review at that branch, and that raising it any further than a quiet lunchroom conversation was a fast way to find her hours cut the following month. So Maya did what tellers under pressure often learn to do. She kept her head down and her hands moving, and she told herself that staying quiet was simply the price of keeping a job she genuinely needed. That is the exact moment Marcus stepped through the revolving doors, 3 weeks of planning a quiet lunch surprise dissolving in an instant. He did not recognize Diane Kessler, had never met her before in his life, but he recognized the posture of his mother's back immediately, the particular straightness she carried when she was holding her temper by force of will alone. He crossed the lobby without a word and stood beside her, close enough that Odette felt him before she saw him. "Mom," he said quietly, "what's going on?" Odette turned, and for the first time all morning something in her shoulders eased slightly. "Marcus," she said, "this is nothing. I'm handling it." Diane looked between them, recalculating. "And you are?" she asked. "Her son," Marcus said. "What seems to be the problem?" Diane's tone shifted immediately into something more careful, more practiced. The register bank employees use once a second adult enters a conversation they had assumed only one confused elderly woman was going to have to navigate alone. "Sir, I appreciate you being here," she said. Your mother is trying to withdraw a very large sum in cash, and given her age, our policy requires additional verification before we can release funds like this. I'm sure you understand the concern." Marcus looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I understand the concern," he said. "I'd like to understand the policy. Is this a written policy or a judgment call?" Diane hesitated just slightly. "It's a discretionary flag built into our fraud system," she said. "Branch managers are authorized to apply additional scrutiny when a transaction pattern seems inconsistent with a customer's typical behavior." "And what pattern is this transaction inconsistent with?" Marcus asked. Diane pulled up something on her screen without turning it toward either of them. "Large cash withdrawals are simply a higher-risk category," she said, "especially for account holders in a certain age bracket. It's not personal, Agent Marsh. It's actuarial." Marcus asked whether the bank could produce documentation showing the actuarial basis for applying that flag specifically to his mother's account that morning, given that she had made comparable withdrawals from the same branch in years past, without triggering any review at all. Diane said she would need to escalate that specific request to compliance and could not answer it on the spot. Marcus noted, evenly, that he would be making that same request formally, through the appropriate regulatory channel, regardless of what happened in the next 5 minutes. Diane's composure held for one more beat before cracking at the edges. "Sir," she said, her voice climbing slightly, "I don't think it's appropriate for me to discuss our internal fraud protocols with a customer. I have a responsibility to this bank and to your mother's well-being, and frankly, your tone is starting to feel confrontational." Marcus did not raise his voice. He reached into his jacket, slowly and deliberately, the exact unhurried motion of someone who has spent a career being careful about how quickly he moves his hands around anyone wearing a badge or standing behind a counter of authority, and set his identification on the marble ledge between them. "My name is Marcus Marsh," he said. "I'm a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I investigate exactly this kind of scheme for a living, on the other side of it. So I promise you, I understand fraud protocols better than almost anyone who is going to walk through that door today. What I don't understand is why an 11-year customer with a clean 32-year banking history at 3 different institutions is being treated like a suspect in her own kitchen table decisions." Diane looked down at the identification without touching it. The lobby, which had been quietly watching for several minutes already, went fully silent. Diane recovered her composure faster than Marcus expected. "That's very impressive," she said, in a tone that made clear she did not find it impressive at all. "But your badge doesn't change our internal risk protocols, Agent Marsh. If anything, it tells me you understand exactly how these scams work, which is precisely why I'd feel more comfortable having a second form of verification before releasing $31,000 in cash to anyone." She reached for the phone at her station. "I'm going to call our loss prevention officer to review the account activity," she said. "This won't take long." It took 11 minutes, during which Odette stood at the counter with her purse still sitting open where Diane had asked to see her identification a second time, flipping through Odette's driver's license, her courthouse retirement badge, and a folded photograph of Samuel in his dress uniform that had fallen out of her wallet onto the counter, which Diane picked up, glanced at, and set aside without comment, the same way you might move an old receipt out of the way. Odette watched her son's jaw tighten at that small gesture, more than at almost anything else that had happened so far. When the loss prevention officer finally called back, Diane put the call on speaker without asking. A tired voice on the other end confirmed there was nothing flagged on the account beyond the standard age-based review trigger, and recommended releasing the funds with a signed acknowledgement form. Diane thanked him, hung up, and turned back to Odette with an expression that suggested she still had not fully let go of her original read on the situation. "I'll need you to sign this," she said, sliding a form across the counter, acknowledging that the bank recommended against this withdrawal and that you're proceeding against that advice. Odette looked at the form for a long moment. I've sat in a courtroom my entire adult life watching people sign things they were pressured into signing, she said quietly. I'm not signing anything that implies I don't understand my own decision. Diane's mouth tightened, but with a federal agent standing beside the counter and a lobby full of witnesses, she did not push further. She counted the bills out slowly, deliberately, in a way that felt less like careful banking practice than like one final small performance of control, and pushed the stack across the counter. Marcus placed his hand briefly on his mother's shoulder, the same gesture Samuel used to make when either of them needed steadying, and said only, "Let's go get lunch, Mom." As they turned to leave, Diane called out behind them, loud enough for the lobby to hear. "For what it's worth," she said, "I was only doing my job. We have to be careful with certain accounts." Odette stopped and turned back around. "Certain accounts," she repeated, "or certain customers, Ms. Kessler." Diane did not answer. In the car afterward, Marcus sat behind the wheel for a full minute without starting the engine, both hands still on it, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the bank's revolving doors. Odette reached over and rested her hand on his arm the way she used to when he was small and working himself up over something at school. "I'm all right," she said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "That's not the point, Mom," he said. "How long has this been happening?" Odette was quiet for a moment before answering honestly, in a way she had not quite let herself be honest even with herself until that exact question was asked out loud. "A while," she said. "Longer than I let myself notice, probably. I kept telling myself I was imagining it." Marcus looked over at her, his jaw tight in the same way it had been at the counter. "You shouldn't have had to convince yourself you weren't imagining your own eyes," he said. Odette did not have an answer for that one either, and for the first time since walking through those revolving doors that morning, she let herself simply sit in the passenger seat and feel, rather than manage, exactly how tired she was. A customer standing in line, a nursing student named Priya Agarwal who had been waiting nearly the entire time to deposit a paycheck, had quietly recorded the last 4 minutes of the exchange on her phone, uncertain, until that final line, whether what she was watching was really what it looked like. She caught Diane's certain accounts remark clearly, along with Odette's reply, and she posted it that evening with a short caption asking whether anyone else had experienced something similar at that branch. She did not expect much to come of it. By midnight, it had passed 400,000 views. Marcus did not wait for the video to spread before he started asking his own questions, because unlike the story that made his mother's mourning into a public spectacle, his own instincts ran the other direction entirely, toward proof before conclusions. Before he did anything else, he called his supervisor at the field office that same night, laid out exactly what had happened, and asked directly whether he needed to recuse himself from any involvement given that the victim was his own mother. His supervisor told him plainly that he could not open or work an active federal case involving a family member, full stop, but that nothing prevented him, as a private citizen, from filing the same public consumer complaint any other customer was entitled to file, provided he did it through ordinary channels and let the regulator's own examiners do the actual investigating from there. Marcus repeated that boundary to himself more than once over the following weeks, resisting the urge more than once to pull records himself the way he would on any other case, because he understood better than almost anyone that the fastest way to undermine a legitimate finding was to let it look like a federal agent had used his badge to settle a family matter. That evening, once Odette was safely settled at home, with Kareen's $31,000 already wired ahead of the lien deadline through a method Kareen trusted, Marcus began pulling together what he actually knew how to pull together professionally, not as a son, but as an investigator who happened to love the woman at the center of it. He could not open a federal case on his own mother's account, and he knew better than to try, so instead he filed a formal consumer complaint with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency the next morning, the same regulator that oversees exactly this kind of enhanced verification policy at nationally chartered banks. And he requested, through entirely public channels available to any customer. First Meridian's published fair lending and account access data. What became public over the following weeks was not something Marcus alone uncovered. It came from the OCC's own examiners. Once the complaint and the viral video together made the review impossible to postpone. Examiners found that First Meridian's enhanced verification flag, the exact policy Diane Kessler invoked at the counter, had been applied to large cash withdrawals from Black and Latino customers at more than 4 times the rate of white customers with comparable account histories and comparable transaction sizes across the bank's tri-state branch network over the previous 6 years. At the branch Diane managed specifically, the disparity was worse than the network average. 18 formal customer complaints had been filed against that single branch over those 6 years, alleging discriminatory account scrutiny. 11 of them named Diane Kessler directly. 9 had been closed internally as customer service issues without escalation to compliance. 2 had never received any response on record at all. A year and a half before that Thursday, Walter Ibe had stood at that same counter needing $800 in cash to cover his wife's dialysis copayment before her afternoon appointment. He had banked at First Meridian for over 20 years, ever since retiring from the Postal Service, and he had never once had trouble withdrawing his own pension funds before. That day, Diane pulled his account up, hesitated, and asked him whether anyone had recently called him claiming to be from the bank, whether he had shared his account number with anyone over the phone, whether someone might be pressuring him to move money quickly. Walter, embarrassed and already running late, answered every question as patiently as he could, told her plainly that this was his own pension money for his own wife's medical bill, and was still made to wait nearly 20 minutes for what he was told was a routine callback confirmation before the funds were released. He arrived at the dialysis center 20 minutes late that afternoon, apologizing to a nurse who assured him it happened all the time, never once telling her, or his wife, or anyone else, exactly why he had been delayed, because he did not have language yet for what had actually happened to him, only a vague, persistent discomfort he carried out of that branch and never fully set down until he saw Priya's video 18 months later and recognized, instantly, the exact tone Diane had used with him that day. Maya Ose submitted a written statement to the OCC examiners during their review, describing what she had quietly observed over 18 months without ever feeling safe enough to say anything sooner. She told them she was coming forward now specifically, because she never wanted another new hire at that branch to spend a year and a half staring down at her own counter the way she had. Her statement became one of the pieces of internal evidence the Commission cited most heavily in its final order, precisely because it came from someone with nothing to gain from testifying and a great deal to lose. Elliot Munro kept her on staff when he took over the branch, and later promoted her into a compliance liaison role, a position that did not exist before that year, and would not have existed at all if she had chosen to keep starring at her own counter indefinitely. Once the OCC's preliminary findings became public record, 2 other customers came forward publicly within the same week alongside Walter. A young entrepreneur named Simone Delacroix, who had built a small catering business from nothing, described being required to bring in 3 separate forms of documentation to withdraw funds for a commercial oven, a level of scrutiny her white business partner never once encountered making similar withdrawals from the same branch. Corrine Yates herself gave an interview from her kitchen table, the same table where she had once cried on the phone to Odette 3 weeks earlier, saying simply that the money that saved her house had almost been held up by someone deciding, without ever asking her a single real question, that an old black woman with $31,000 in savings must be a victim rather than simply a saver. Jonathan Reyes, a local business reporter who had covered the regional banking sector for over a decade, spent 11 days cross-referencing the OCC's preliminary data against public court records and internal complaint logs obtained through a records request, before publishing a two-part investigation titled The Discretion Gap, laying out the branch's pattern in plain numbers next to the customer's own accounts of what those numbers had actually felt like standing at the counter. He interviewed 6 current and former First Meridian employees for the piece, 2 of whom described, on condition of anonymity, watching Diane apply the enhanced verification flag inconsistently for years and never once raising it themselves out of fear of losing their own positions at a branch where she controlled scheduling and performance reviews. National outlets picked the story up within days, in part because it touched a fear that reached far beyond any one branch or any one bank. The quiet suspicion that a lifetime of careful saving could still be treated as suspicious depending entirely on who was standing at the counter to receive it. Morning news programs booked financial literacy experts to explain enhanced verification policies to viewers who had never heard the term before and were now anxiously checking their own bank's fine print. A consumer advocacy nonprofit published a nationwide guide within the same week explaining customers' rights when a bank places a hold on their own funds, crediting the case directly for the surge in requests. Social media users in dozens of cities began sharing their own stories using a hashtag built from Diane's own words, certain accounts, and within a month, similar internal reviews had quietly begun at 2 other regional banks whose names never made headlines at all, simply because compliance departments elsewhere did not want to become the next Jonathan Ray's story. First Meridian's corporate leadership placed Diane Kessler on administrative leave within 48 hours of the video crossing 1 million views, and terminated her employment 2 weeks later, once the OCC's preliminary report reached the bank's board directly. The bank's chief executive issued a public apology and announced an independent civil rights audit of every branch in its tri-state network, along with a complete redesign of the enhanced verification system to remove branch manager discretion entirely, replacing it with a uniform, appealable, dollar threshold policy applied identically regardless of the customer standing at the window. 4 days after Priya's video passed 2 million views, First Meridian's board of directors convened an emergency session that ran past 11 at night. Several directors initially pushed for a narrow response, a quiet settlement with Odette specifically, a carefully worded statement expressing regret without admitting any broader pattern. One director, a former state banking regulator named Howard Chu, who had joined the board only the previous year, interrupted that discussion to say plainly that he had reviewed the branch-level withdrawal data himself over the weekend, and that the disparity was not a close call requiring careful wording. It was a 5-year pattern that any competent examiner would have caught years earlier had anyone bothered to look. He told the room that treating this as a public relations problem rather than a compliance failure would only guarantee a second scandal within the decade, at a different branch, with a different name attached to the headline. His statement did not end the meeting, but it shifted its direction. By the time the board adjourned, it had authorized full cooperation with the OCC's examination, voted to commission its own independent civil rights audit across every branch in the network, and quietly began the internal process that would lead to Diane Kessler's termination 2 weeks later. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency issued a formal consent order against First Meridian requiring restitution to every customer identified in the 6-year pattern, along with independent monitoring of its fair lending practices for the following 3 years. Separately, 4 affected customers, including Odette, Walter Ibe, and Simone Delacroix, filed a civil suit under federal fair lending law alleging discriminatory denial of banking services. The bank settled that suit for $11.4 million rather than proceed to trial, a sum distributed across dozens of affected accounts once the full 6-year pattern was accounted for. Diane Kessler's own case proceeded separately, before a state banking commission empowered to bar individuals from working in federally regulated financial institutions. At that hearing, held over 3 days in a plain conference room with none of a criminal courtroom's theater, Odette testified first, describing not just that one Thursday, but the quiet calculation she had done for years beforehand, always bringing a folder of extra documentation to that branch just in case, always dressing a certain way before a large transaction, always rehearsing, in the car beforehand, exactly how she would explain herself if anyone asked. Under cross-examination from Diane's attorney, a measured woman named Rosalind Pratt, Odette was asked whether she could point to any single instance before that Thursday where she had been explicitly told a decision was based on her race. Odette answered that nobody who behaves this way ever says it explicitly, that the entire design of quiet discrimination is that it never has to be said out loud to be felt every single time, and that 32 years transcribing courtroom testimony had taught her exactly how rarely people confess to anything they do not have to. Walter Ibe testified next, describing the specific shame of being questioned about his wife's medical withdrawal in front of other customers, a shame he said he had never mentioned to his wife, because he did not want her worrying about money on top of everything else. Under cross-examination, Rosalind Pratt suggested that a 20-minute wait for a callback confirmation was standard banking procedure and not evidence of anything beyond ordinary caution. Walter answered that he had made the same kind of medical withdrawal at 2 other branches in the years since, without ever once being asked a single verification question, and that the difference, in his experience, had nothing to do with the size of the withdrawal. Simone Delacroix brought her business partner to testify as well, a white woman named Katie Voss who described, under oath, that she had withdrawn a nearly identical sum for the same commercial equipment purchased the same month and had been asked for nothing beyond her signature. When Rosalind Pratt asked Katie whether she could be certain the 2 transactions were truly comparable, Katie replied that she had brought her own bank statement to the hearing specifically because she suspected she would be asked that question, and read the transaction details into the record herself. Maya Ose testified as well, her voice shaking through her opening sentences before steadying, describing 18 months of watching the same pattern from 2 feet away and staying silent out of genuine fear for her own job. She told the commission that she was not proud of how long it took her to speak up, and that she hoped her statement counted for something precisely because it came from someone who had far less power in that building than anyone else who had testified. Rosalind Pratt asked her, gently, whether she had ever directly heard Diane state a discriminatory reason for a decision. Maya said no, and added that in her experience, nobody who behaves this way ever needs to say it out loud for the person on the other side of the counter to understand exactly what is happening. When Diane took the stand in her own defense, she told the commission she had genuinely believed she was protecting vulnerable customers, and that 22 years of service should count for something against a handful of misunderstandings. The commission's own data analyst walked through the branch's 6-year withdrawal records line by line, showing that Diane had personally applied the enhanced verification flag to Black and Latino customers at a rate 5 times higher than her own branch's white customers, a pattern that held steady across every year of her tenure regardless of transaction size, account history, or stated purpose. When asked to explain the disparity in her own numbers, Diane had no answer the commission found credible. In closing, Rosalind Pratt asked the commission to weigh 22 years of otherwise clean performance reviews against what she described as a handful of judgment calls made under genuine pressure to protect elderly and vulnerable customers from real and documented fraud. She reminded the commission that no customer had ever lost money permanently, that every disputed withdrawal had eventually been released. The commission's own counsel closed by reminding everyone present that the harm in this case had never been about money that was eventually released. It had been about who was made to prove themselves worthy of their own funds, again and again, for 6 years, while the customer standing 2 windows down moved identical sums without a single question asked. 22 years of service, counsel said, is not a defense to a 6-year pattern. It is simply the length of time the pattern was allowed to continue. The commission issued a formal removal and industry prohibition order, barring Diane Kessler permanently from working in any federally insured financial institution for the remainder of her career, and referred the matter to state prosecutors to determine whether her conduct met the threshold for a separate civil rights violation under the state's public accommodations law. Prosecutors ultimately declined criminal charges, concluding that existing statutes were not written with this exact pattern of quiet, procedural discrimination in mind, a gap in the law that state legislators, following the case's publicity, introduced a bill to close within the following legislative session. The Comptroller's office did not stop at First Meridian. Citing the case directly in its public reasoning, the agency issued new supervisory guidance to every nationally chartered bank in the country the following spring, requiring any discretionary fraud prevention flag applied unevenly across a customer base to be documented, justified in writing at the time it is applied, and subject to a customer's right to an immediate, in-person appeal rather than a callback queue that could stretch for days. Consumer advocates called it the most significant tightening of discretionary account hold rules in over a decade. Banking industry groups pushed back initially, arguing the new documentation requirements would slow legitimate fraud prevention, though within a year, several of the same institutions were citing their own compliance with the new standard in their annual reports as evidence of responsible governance. 8 months before that Thursday, Simone Delacroix had walked into the same branch needing $9,000 to put a deposit on a used commercial oven for the catering business she had built from a single folding table at farmers' markets into a company with 4 part-time employees. She brought her business partner, Katie Voss, along that day simply because they were headed to look at the equipment together afterward. Diane asked Simone for her business license, her most recent tax return, and a notarized letter explaining the purpose of the withdrawal, telling her the bank needed to verify the transaction matched a legitimate business purpose before releasing funds of that size. Simone had all 3 documents in her bag already, because she had learned over 2 years of banking at that branch to simply bring everything every time. Katie, standing beside her, mentioned that she had withdrawn a nearly identical amount for equipment the previous month, and had only been asked to sign a standard form. Diane told her that different accounts sometimes triggered different review levels depending on transaction history, and processed Simone's withdrawal only after reviewing all 3 documents page by page, while 4 customers waited behind them in line. 6 months later, the branch looked and operated like a different institution entirely. A new manager, a soft-spoken man named Elliot Monroe, who had spent a decade in community banking, before coming to First Meridian specifically to help implement the new fair access reforms, personally reviewed every enhanced verification flag generated at that branch each week, reporting the raw numbers publicly on a community bulletin board in the lobby, broken down with no names attached, simply to keep everyone honest going forward. Elliot had grown up watching his own grandmother, a seamstress who never fully trusted banks after being turned away from a mortgage decades earlier for reasons no loan officer ever wrote down honestly. And he told his new staff during his first week that he had taken this particular posting on purpose, because he wanted, just once in his career, to run a branch where nobody's grandmother ever had a story like that to tell about it. The bank funded a financial literacy program for retirees across its tri-state footprint, offering free one-on-one sessions to help older customers understand exactly what protections they were entitled to, and how to escalate a dispute if a branch ever treated them the way Odette had been treated. Corrine Yates kept her house. She still calls Odette every Sunday evening, the same as she has for 40 years, though these days the calls are considerably less tearful. Odette agreed, after months of Marcus gently encouraging her to testify before a state legislative committee considering the new public accommodations bill, describing in her own calm, precise courtroom-trained language exactly what it costs a person to be treated as a suspect inside the very institution meant to safeguard a lifetime of careful saving. The bill passed the following spring. Legislators named it, at Odette's own quiet insistence and over her initial objection, the Samuel Marsh Fair Access Act. After a firefighter she had loved for 22 years who had spent his whole life running toward danger for people he had never met, believing that was simply what decent people did when they saw someone in trouble. Marcus returned to his financial crimes unit the following month, though he says the case changed something permanent in how he approaches every elder fraud victim who sits across from him now. A little slower to assume, he already understands what shame looks like on another person's face. Priya Agarwal, the nursing student who filmed the original video, still banks at that same branch. She says Elliot Munro remembered her name the very first time she walked back in. On a quiet Thursday nearly a year after that first one, Odette walked into First Meridian to make a routine deposit. Elliot Munro greeted her by name from behind the same counter, though the woman standing behind it now smiled at her the way you smile at someone you are simply glad to see. Odette signed nothing she did not want to sign. Nobody asked her a single question about her own money. She was in and out in 4 minutes, which she says, more than any lawsuit or any settlement or any bill passed in her name, is the thing that actually told her something real had changed. She could have closed her account the day after that Thursday and never looked back. Plenty of people would have. Instead, she kept banking there, kept showing up, kept being the same careful, exacting woman she had always been because showing up, she says, is what actually holds reform in place after the cameras leave. Not a settlement number, not a headline, presence. 1 year to the day after that first Thursday, the branch hosted a community financial literacy fair in its parking lot, folding tables and free coffee, and a line of retirees waiting to sit down one-on-one with a banker for the first time in their lives without a single worry about what questions might be asked of them. Walter Ibe volunteered at a table explaining pension withdrawals to other retired postal workers from his old route. Simone Delacroix set up a small stand selling pastries from the same catering business that Oven had eventually helped her grow, donating every dollar of that day's proceeds to the literacy program itself, with Katie Voss working the register beside her the whole afternoon exactly as she had every weekend since the two of them first became partners. Corrine Yates sat beside Odette the entire afternoon, the two of them greeting neighbors the way they had greeted each other every Sunday for 40 years. Elliot Munro worked the crowd in his shirt sleeves, remembering names the way he always did. Maya Osei ran the sign-in table, greeting every single retiree who arrived with the same warmth she wished someone had shown her during her own first, quieter year at that branch. Marcus stopped by on his lunch break, standing near the back the way his mother once described her own husband, standing near the edge of rooms his whole life, present without needing to be at the center of anything. Dignity should never depend on whether the person asking a question happens to recognize your face, your badge, or your son's employer. The Diane Kesslers of the world do not survive because any one of them is especially powerful. They survive because a policy meant to protect people gets applied by hand, quietly, differently, depending on who is standing at the counter, and because most of the people it happens to decide, understandably, that it is easier to simply take their business elsewhere than to fight a system built to make them doubt themselves first. You do not need a federal badge to stop a Diane Kessler. You need a phone, a witness, and the willingness to ask, clearly and out loud, whether a policy is really being applied the same way to everyone in that room. So here is my question for you. If you were standing in that line and you heard exactly what Marcus heard, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, pulled out your phone, asked her name and title? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your business and let it go the way 18 other complaints at that same branch were quietly let go before you? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story reached you somewhere real, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one, because there is a Diane Kessler behind a counter somewhere right now. The only question left is who is going to be standing in line when it happens.